The first decade of my career as a Foreign Service officer was the Cold War, and it was the end of the Cold War. The collapse of the Warsaw Pact, the collapse of the Soviet Union as a nation state, the end and destruction of the Berlin Wall, the unification of Germany, all this happening peacefully without a shot being fired, hundreds of millions of people being liberated from communist totalitarianism. It was the biggest event of my career. It's the biggest event of modern history in a lot of ways. And I was just fortunate to end up on the National Security Council for President George H.W. Bush, Bush 41, as we call him, and President Clinton, as a Soviet and then Russian affairs advisor, and had this unique vantage point of watching as this supremely gifted American President George H.W. Bush, there was a diplomat. One of our finest diplomats was President George H.W. Bush. He'd been ambassador to the United Nations. He had been our minister to China before we had full diplomatic relations. He'd been vice president, he'd been director of the CIA, he knew the world. And to see him work in a very sophisticated way with a descending Gorbachev, a Gorbachev who was losing power, and an ascending Boris Yeltsin who was gaining power in Russia, to see the skillful way that he helped to manage the end of the Cold War by unifying Germany in NATO through brilliant negotiations along with his Secretary of State James Baker. It's inspiring to look back upon those times. And I happen to be, one of my jobs as National Security Council staffer is we take notes on the President's phone calls. And on Christmas morning 1991, I was at home with my wife and I with our 3 girls, little kids, and they're opening Christmas presents, and the phone rang. It was the White House operator saying President Bush was going to talk to President Gorbachev for the last time. Gorbachev was literally leaving his office. The hammer and sickle was coming down from the Kremlin. The Soviet Union was going to cease to be in several hours. And just to be part of that phone call, a passive observer, listening in, taking notes for President Bush, and witnessing the end of the Cold War, witnessing the triumph of American ideals, of democracy, of human rights, of self-determination. We won because of the power of our ideas.